Shalom, Boker Tov. Just general observations, I suppose. Um, well, right off the bat, the roommate apologized and promised it would never happen again. Is a mushroom deal. But now, because I was in a drug-free environment, I thought, and now that he's done that, my mind is, raging through all these stressors. It's stressing itself out. I'm constantly trying to quiet my thoughts and shut my mind off to stop thinking, well, they're smoking weed now and they're on mushrooms now, and oh, he woke up late and he's late for work. It's the drugs. I'm missing stuff now. It's the drugs. He's on the drugs. But he did apologize and promise it would never happen again. And I accepted the apology and hope that his word means something this time. Right? Whitey can't live without his booze and his drugs, but he did seem genuine. He did seem like he really meant it, so I hope so. But now, even yesterday, I was interacting with them and just automatically suspicious they were on mushrooms because that's what that's the drug deal he did. Anyway, hopefully it works out because I really do want to pay back my student loans. And staying with them is so far the only way that's possible because of the cheap rent deal they're offering me to stay long term. What a fucking nightmare. It reminds me of prohibition of alcohol. The Native American pancreas and liver doesn't secrete the enzymes necessary to process and metabolize alcohol and sugar. Hence why the Native American alcohol overdose death rate is 13%, roughly, where it's 5% globally for almost everyone else, with the exception of Aborigines, etc. This is due to intergenerational incest over the centuries, being isolated on the Americas, on a continent with no global trade networks, no transatlantic or transpacific, you know, routes, etc. So prohibition would have been really good and was really good, not just for the Native American, but for Whitey, just because Whitey or European genetics on average have a greater resilience to substance consumption does not mean Whitey is invincible to the harmful effects of drugs, which is pretty apparent every time you see homeless white people on drugs. And not just in cities like Philadelphia. Or white people, young white people in their 20s and 30s who, you know, end up doing drugs or dealing drugs on Saturday night and then not showing up to be the sound guy for church on Sunday and waking up late and getting into work late on Monday. This could be a escalating cycle of his life falling apart. I hope not. Anyhow, Whitey giving up the booze through prohibition would have been really good for engines for Native Americans. But Whitey is so selfish and shitty that he could not live without his booze and his drugs. He'd rather let Native Americans die than go sober. Anyhow, I attended the Reform Judaism Zoom synagogue again last Saturday. I don't know why. I think maybe I was bored and seeking familiarity because they were on Vashon, where I did spend a good chunk of my life, as you know, when I was homeless and schizophrenic, and then after electrocuting myself. That's one of my vague associations of stability, but at the same time, I have very negative associations with it because of, well, what I'm about to explain. But the woman asked me about what got me to Judaism. Uh, the lesbian couple in the Zoom meeting. Oh my goodness. Even though this week's parasha very specifically prohibited sodomy with capital punishment. They shall be put to death. Their blood is on their hands. So abomination, right? It is an abomination. Man shall not lie with another man. Yeah. But this is what got me to where I'm at now. I told you this vaguely, but I just want to go into more specific details. When I was on Vashon, I was very atheist and liberal. I was not even aware of the level of deception and manipulation of rich white people. I didn't even know that rich white liberals were a separate ethnicity than Ashkenazi. I didn't even know what an Ashkenazi was. So when I left Seattle, I had identified that I had a mental illness. And rich white liberals, including the Ashkenazi, like the people in that Zoom meeting of Vashon, who I just thought they were rich and white and liberal. I didn't realize they were Jewish. I've learned so much. But none of them were honest enough to admit that I had schizophrenia or mental illness in general, or that marijuana activates and exacerbates schizophrenia and causes mental illness. This could have been prevented had they just been honest. So, among other things, there was other negative events that occurred that they enabled instead of prevented through the marijuana culture, the alcohol culture, etc. I think it's how they keep the population down on Vashon, drugs and alcohol, etc. It's very Darwinian. Anyhow, when I left there, I began to identify the environmental stimulus that acts as contributing factors to maladaptive thoughts and behavior. I identified marijuana, including secondhand marijuana, as one of those factors. Growing up poor Mexican in Mexican, ranchero farming families, I was not aware or educated on this level of deception and manipulation that these rich white liberals and Ashkenazis were capable of and doing. I was completely victimized by it, well, painted as the villain. It's very, very clever, very effective. They're not rich because they're stupid. Anyway. Oh, the dog with the barking. So when I left Vashon, I saw that they were holding the knife in my back and pointing the finger at Trump and the Christian conservatives, the right wing, because they're all liberal. And they had screwed me over in real life by pushing marijuana on me and, suppressing a diagnosis of my mental illness, denying me treatment, depriving me of treatment, very strategic, etc. And so literally, it was like they were the ones who would fuck me over in real life, and they would get on Facebook and, oh, it's evil white Christian men, oh, the Republicans, da, da, da. They're the ones who screwed you over. Like they were holding the knife in my back and pointing the finger at the other white people, the right wing, the Christians, the conservatives, etc. And so I thought, well, maybe it's white people without Christianity that have these high rates of drug use and STDs, drug overdose death rates, alcohol consumption, alcoholism, etc. And it reminds me, or I know for a fact actually, when I analyze my memories, that when I grew up in Albuquerque, the rich white neighborhood was the Heights. And that was the most affluent neighborhood in the city of, Hispanics. And we thought God, the Spanish Catholics, taught that God was rewarding them for their morality. So I thought, therefore, oh, well, whitey with Christianity is drug free, sexually moral, doesn't commit adultery, etc., etc., etc. Needless to say, I have since been disillusioned from this vague and inaccurate overgeneralization. But my ulterior motive was if I entered a Christian church, if I returned to Christianity, I didn't even know what Judaism was. I would find a community that was drug free and sexually moral and supportive. The efficacy of their support would be not what Vashon's was, which was supportive in word, but actually destructive in action, because of the deception and the manipulation of Vashonites. So, if I entered a church, if I returned to Christianity, therefore I would eliminate the presence of secondhand marijuana and involuntary exposure, or forced drugging or involuntary intoxication from my environment. And by eliminating marijuana from the environment, I would prevent and reduce schizophrenic positive symptom presentation, hallucinations, suicidal, homicidal thoughts, violent outbursts, etc. That's not an exaggeration. In Albuquerque, the last incident that I had, major incident, in 2018, a Mexican was smoking marijuana next door. The secondhand weed blew into my house that I was living at because it was hot, so I had the doors and windows open. That sent me into a schizophrenic episode 20 minutes before the landlord showed up. And it was so bad, I put the landlord in the hospital with 7 stitches on his head with a baseball bat because of the secondhand marijuana. So, secondhand marijuana was the cause, that was the effect. And this is a repeating pattern throughout my life. So, if I eliminate the cause, I eliminate the effect. Apply the scientific method, process of elimination. Well, it worked. I did move to North Carolina, where it was still illegal, even CBD for a little bit. And I started calling the cops every time I smelled weed, and they would show up, and it actually worked for a period of time. And then the greedy globalist had to fuck it all up. But I kept journals. I began to follow the advice of the psychology books I was reading, and I began to document symptoms, time, date, location, cause, and the symptoms I was experiencing, what I was seeing in my hallucinations, the thoughts in my head. I would write down the sentences they were saying, the voices in my head, things like that. And with the elimination of secondhand marijuana involuntary exposure by removing it from my surroundings, my immediate environment, it was an 80 to 90% reduction in schizophrenic episodes as well as positive symptom presentation. So, unfortunately, even though that was in the Bible Belt, um, the white Christians in North Carolina eventually did push towards CBD and methamphetamine. A lot of meth use from the whites around here, Virginia, North Carolina, etc. And so it seemed that even with Christianity, much like my roommates now, why do you still a junkie? uh, but in that process, I began to look at the Old Testament and look at the Hebrew. And I thought, well, maybe Jews would be better than whites. Maybe Jews would be what I had hoped whites would be, but they disappointed and failed me to be. Maybe Jews would be sober and drug free. And therefore, if I convert to Judaism, I could find this, pocket, this zone, a drug free zone where no one smokes marijuana. And sure enough, the Jews also failed, as well as the Muslims, etc., etc., etc. But I don't really have any family or friends. Haven't for most of my life because of the drugs that the globalists have pushed on the United States. They destroy families. They separate families. At least my family. Apparently, white people with a greater genetic resilience. Not all whites, obviously, but this particular individual that I'm living with, they're still a strong, connected family. But he quit marijuana 3 years ago because it was making him see demons. But he continued to sell it up until a year ago. He still sells mushrooms. So apparently, I don't know if it's a genetic thing, but whites on average, not all of them, obviously, they're very good, wonderful, drug-free and anti-drug whites. I had lunch with one yesterday, ex-law enforcement, great guy. But this white Christian that I'm living with doesn't give a shit about the fact that even though the drugs were so harmful for him, he doesn't give a fuck about the fact that he's harming others with drugs because he's making money. So I can see why whites and Ashkenazi, at least the rich white liberal Ashkenazi of Vashon, and these working class white Christian conservatives, and the trailer trash conservatives from my last living situation, I could see how they get along so well, how they have that one thing in common: greed.